A fishing trip gone horribly wrong. A giant sea monster allegedly sighted by the whole crew of a freighter. Yeah, I'm thinking today's episode of Scary Stories may just excite and terrify you. These are 6 allegedly true stories featuring open water, demonic land, and a peculiar man with no mouth. If you like what I do, please leave a like and share this video with friends or family. I'm sure they need something to cure their boredom too. If you have a scary story and you want me to narrate it, share it with us at darkstories.org. I'd love to hear about some monsters seen in the snow or Yeti encounters. By the way, what's the weirdest or funniest thing that has ever happened to you during a road trip? One time I played too much Golden Sun on my Game Boy in the back seat, and I emptied my stomach on the floor. Motion sickness is a heck of a thing. Now then, let's begin. The Fishing Trip. From Zach. This happened several years ago, after I had just turned 14. My father, my uncle, and I went on a night fishing trip. My father and uncle invited me to a fishing trip to mark my coming of age. I always begged to go with them, but I had been too young up until then. They went night fishing on the full moon of every month. The full moon was supposed to attract bigger fish. I don't know how true that is, but that's what I've been told. And after that particular night, when we caught no fish, I was especially skeptical about that claim. But we did, however, experience something that forced us to get back to shore as quickly as possible. Dad and I had packed our gear and drove to my uncle's to pick him up. We got to the docking yard around 11 p.m. that night. Then we began packing our gear onto the boat. The fishing boat was small, but it fit the 3 of us comfortably. My dad and uncle had rigged a 200 horsepower engine on it when they bought it, so it could go pretty fast. We left the dock nearing 12 p.m. when the moon was straight above us. Its moonlight illuminated our way to the fishing spot. They made me swear to keep their spot a secret, as if I knew how to get back here myself. On the other hand, this did make me feel accepted, so I was very happy to agree. We were roughly 2 miles out when the boat started to slow down. "We're here," my dad said. It was impressive how they could come back to the same spot again when there were no landmarks, only small islets far off in the distance. It only later occurred to me that these boats were equipped with computerized coordinates. I'd never been so far out to sea. With no lights around us, the moon looked more full than ever, presenting details I'd never noticed on it before. It offered us enough light to get our fishing rods out and ready. It was quiet out there. At this time, there were no other boats around, only the sound of the sea and wind. Obviously, there were no crickets out there on the water. We were all on one side of the boat. My dad and uncle had their lines cast while I worked on tying and baiting my hook. It was then that I heard a splashing on the opposite side of the boat. I dropped what I was doing and went over to see if it was a dolphin. They were common around this time of year, but rarely seen at night. I looked into the water on the side of the boat. There was no dolphin or fish, but there was a glowing blur of redness coming from deep below. It's hard to explain, but it glowed similar to a fire and seemed to be moving downward as it quickly faded out of sight. The 2 of them asked me what it was, but I didn't want to explain what I saw, as I thought that they wouldn't believe me. So I just said it was nothing. As I turned away from the water, something hit the boat hard from underneath with a loud bang. The boat shook. It was like a cannonball had hit the boat from underneath. My dad and uncle both cursed. I dropped to the floor in shock. We had no idea what could have done that. They said maybe it was a shark, but I was thinking there was no way a shark would slam and rock a boat so hard. But the anxiety and fear of the situation was enough for us to go to another spot. My uncle and dad began to pull up the anchor. They got the anchor up, and I looked back into the water where I'd previously seen the red glow. It was there again now, but this time I quickly called the other two over to see it. They definitely saw it and could not decipher what it could be. It seemed to be getting bigger, and we realized whatever it was moving upward, fast. We knew we had to get out of there. The boat sped away, and we seemed to be in the clear. But when I looked behind us, I could still see it, just below the surface of the waves the boat made. It was there in the water, and it was chasing us. I was frightened more than I've ever been in my life. We were in the vast open sea with whatever hit our boat from below, right behind us. My dad reached maximum speed. The boat seemed to hit every swell head-on, throwing the vessel into the air, causing it to violently land back on the surface of the water. We all were holding on to something by then, otherwise we would have been thrown overboard, which would mean we'd get to experience what that thing in the water was behind us. While my dad drove, I kept myself as low as possible, gripping anything I could. My uncle screamed at it, asking what it wanted, as though it had a conscience. Looking back on it now, I'm pretty sure that whatever it was, I believe it meant to do us harm. We got to around 3 minutes from the shore when it was no longer behind us. In our fear, we left everything on the boat and jumped onto the dock as fast as we could. The dockyard worker asked us what all the hustle was about, but we didn't really know what to say. We told no one. After all, it was an extremely frightful, yet unbelievably strange encounter, one that people would probably doubt. I'm in my 20s now. I've drunkenly told this story once or twice, but people usually laugh about it. Just some drunken tale. That was the last time any of us went out to sea at night, and never again to the same spot. We still have those coordinates saved, not to go back, but to avoid it at all costs. Creature in New Mexico, from Tiffany M. My husband, mother-in-law, myself, and at the time our 3 children were moving back to Oregon from Tennessee in early 2015. We were bound to have a terrible time as soon as we started. I mean, right away we began having serious car trouble. After getting through slowly to New Mexico, we got temporarily stranded at a small settlement on the Navajo reservation. At first, everything was fine. The people who lived there were amazing, kind, and overall some of the best people I've ever met. We had some dogs at the time and were told under no circumstances to leave or let them out after dark, as being in the middle of nowhere, there were several types of predators around, among quote-unquote other things that would love to get a hold of your dogs. That was fine with us, as it was an unfamiliar area. In the meantime, we did what we'd been doing all along, and began trying to find a new water pump and thermostat for the car. This took almost a week, and the closest place was the next town over, which was about 20 miles away. While searching for these items, and how to get there, things began getting a little strange, to say the least. The people began to get more nervous around us, aside from the children who lived in the small community. Cats and other house pets started turning up missing through our stay, things of that nature. Well, the kids decided to take us out exploring one day, with their parents' permission, of course. They decided to take us to a short cave they knew of. We left around 10:30 a.m., and it was about an hour walk to the cave. Nothing was overly strange about the cave, or the half-hour walk through it, from one side to the other. There were a couple of bats, some low-hanging pieces of rock we had to belly crawl under, pretty much normal cave stuff. However, when we got out on the other side, it was getting dark. That in and of itself was extremely odd, and shouldn't have been possible. However, it was, so we decided to take the road back to make sure we wouldn't lose our footing if it got dark. Then the really strange things happened. There was no wind, and it was eerily silent. The kids we were with had begun to almost run back to the small town, and we were all doing all we could to keep up with them. It felt as if we were being watched and stalked at the same time. There were no sounds of crickets or other night insects. Then we began hearing what sounded like coyotes howling and yipping quite suddenly, and they were close. Then came the voices of some of the tribe members. The kids told us to ignore the voices, to not look behind us no matter what. All the while they kept their heads tilted slightly down. We did as we were told, as the voices continued to call our names one by one. When it began to use my mother-in-law's voice, trying to get my attention, I knew this was all wrong. It even used the whistle she uses to call us when we're out and about, to let us know something is up. After about 20 minutes, one of the adults showed up in their car to pick us up. When we got inside to go back, we were asked what we heard or saw. We explained everything. We could see the color drain from his face. He floored it, but before he could, I looked everywhere for a source of the calls, but saw nothing. Though I did smell sulfur and death, which were thick in the air by this point. The following morning, we were told we needed to leave, as we were bringing devils around by being there. We were told it was nothing against us personally, and they wished they could do more to help us out, but they wanted us gone. We had until sundown, but even then, that was more than enough time. We got all of our things, and we were in the next town in less than an hour. My mother-in-law asked what that was all about. She and I are believers, but my husband is not. We both told her the same thing about the voices, and she went pale as well. None of us could explain it away. We decided there was only one thing this could have been: a skinwalker in the New Mexico desert. The Evil Cross from Guatemala, from AuroraG. This is my experience from years ago. For a long time, weird things happened in my house. Things flying off of shelves, stuff going missing, water appearing in random places. One day I was asleep and someone or something threw a pillow on my face. My mom claimed she saw a shadow standing in the kitchen once. I had a friend of mine who never wanted to come over because whatever was in there seemed to hate him. He went to my house only 3 times total. The first time, all the lights went off when he walked in. The second time, something locked him in the bathroom, and he had to jump from the window because we could not get the door to open. And the last time, we were in my room, and I had this big heavy clock made of metal that flew right across the room, hitting him right where it hurts. My mom is a Catholic, so we had many priests coming to the house, praying and spraying holy water. But things seemed to only get worse, until every priest my mom called didn't answer, or they would just make up excuses. By then, I was feeling sick for a while. I went to doctors and did every single test there was, and no one could tell me what was wrong with me. I was having problems breathing, suddenly passing out. From time to time, my nose would bleed, and I would have to vomit almost every day, not to mention the headaches, and the list just keeps going. My mom was crying every day out of desperation. We went to America to run more tests, but they could not figure out what was going on with me either. One day, a friend of my mom's told her that maybe it was the house. They gave her a number of a lady that goes to your home and gets rid of whatever's in there. As I said before, my mom is a Catholic, so doing something like this was really out of her character. But she was so desperate and worried. She called the woman the same day her friend gave her the advice, and this lady was in my home the next morning. I was at school feeling sick. I was feeling really sick 24 hours a day. It was exhausting. This lasted for almost 2 years. My mother didn't tell me about the lady, so I was completely clueless about what was going on at the house, when suddenly, out of nowhere, I felt better. I mean, just like that. I was sitting in my desk at math class and it happened. I felt fine. For the first time in so long. Relief flooded through me. I was confused and thought it was all in my head or something. When I went home, my mom wasn't there. She arrived some hours later, and I swear to you she looked younger and refreshed. She told me about the lady, and how as soon as this woman entered our house, she went pale and looked suddenly scared, but didn't say anything. She walked around the first floor for a couple of minutes and told my mom that the evil was coming out of my room. She said my name, even though my mom claims she never mentioned my name. She walked to my room with my mom behind her. She immediately knew where my room was somehow, without my mom telling her anything. And as soon as she entered, all the stuff on my shelves and in my bed fell to the floor. She told my mother to stay outside and locked herself in my room for about 40 minutes. When she finally came out, she was holding a shirt I owned with a cross I had over the door. She told my mom to go to a river immediately to get rid of it. It had to be a river out of the city. They went there together, and she put the cross in the ground. The lady began to pray very loud, and as soon as she dropped the first drop of holy water on the silver cross, it turned black. Smoke began to pour out of it. My mom said that it stank so much that she threw up on the ground and felt so tired she could go to sleep right there. But the woman told her it was very important for her to stay awake. The woman never told my mom what was in that cross, but she did ask how we got it. The thing is, the cross was in that house when we bought it. Until today, we had no idea that there was something wrong with it. But I never felt sick since that day. Sailor Stories from My Dad, from J. Ion. My dad used to work for a freight company that delivered cargo all over the world via transoceanic routes. In his time working there, he has been to all of the important waterways in the world: the Panama Canal, the Strait of Magellan, the Bering Strait, the South China Sea. Basically, if you can name it, he's been there when it comes to waterways. However, it was always when the ship he was on was traversing through deep international waters that he witnessed some of the most bizarre and terrifying things that most men have never seen nor heard of. More than once in his career, he witnessed whirlpools that emerged suddenly, or watched as a whirlpool grows larger and larger until the edge of it got dangerously close to the ship. He claimed that once a ship that he was on actually got pulled into the tides of a large whirlpool. The captain and crew actually got on their knees and stretched their arms out to beg for divine intervention, as there was no other means of escaping the situation. But the ship got pulled deeper and closer to the center of the whirlpool, and just before they were completely submerged, the ship was ejected out of the whirlpool like it was being sped out violently and landed on the outermost edge of it, where the pull of the tides were weakest. The ship powered on, out of the area. This is amongst the many reasons why my dad truly believes in the existence of a benevolent God and is a devout Catholic. Even in situations where the ship, its cargo, and the crew were not in imminent danger, strange incidents would occur that completely defy human knowledge. On one very bright moonlit night in the middle of the Pacific, he was on night duty, checking the perimeters of the cargo hold. When he was on the starboard side of the ship, he noticed an enormous dark shape slowly and steadily swim up to the side of the ship he was on. He thought it might be an unusually large school of fish, or even sharks, or a giant squid, but the shape of the creature was far larger and rounder than any of those animals. He was gobsmacked at the size of this creature. When it was finally parallel to the side of the ship, it was the same length as the 965 feet long vessel, which is nearly 300 meters. Even blue whales do not grow to that size. Colossal squids don't get that colossal. He said that the creature itself looked like a pitch-black goldfish. It was solid black from front to back, and it was the most intense, darkest black that made it visible in the ocean, even though it was nighttime in deep waters. It had a head with a round tip like a goldfish, and the body was rather bulky, but still streamlined like a goldfish. The tail and fins were moving in a cascading manner, with occasional relaxed flexes to propel itself forward, slowly, like most goldfish do. It was such an odd sight that several of the crew on duty that night just dropped whatever they were doing and stood along the starboard to watch as the gigantic, darker-than-black goldfish-like creature moved alongside the ship. Even the captain, who had been asleep in his cabin, had woke up so that he could see the creature for himself and make a note of it, which he unfortunately could not do, because unless anything around the ship presented a threat to the cargo or crew, or the structural soundness of the vessel, it was not recorded as per company policy. They watched in awe, though, and in a bit of fear, all while the creature propelled itself gracefully out of sight into much deeper water, and did not appear again. When the ship docked at their next port, my dad had some time off, so he went to the nearest library to look for answers on what this fish may have been. Sadly, none of the resources he looked at gave any answers. Even when he asked the locals about urban legends or folklore regarding deep-sea creatures, especially ones pertaining to enormous fish, no one had a clue. Even today, with the internet and tons of marine research being done, there is still no answer as to what my dad witnessed. It's been 30 years since my dad saw that gargantuan black goldfish-like creature, and 20 years since he was in danger of being swallowed by an ungodly whirlpool. He retired from that freight company 10 years ago. Now, when anyone asks for the most memorable experiences of his time out in open waters, he tells these two stories. Whether anyone believes his tales, though, that is irrelevant, because I know he was not alone in enduring those hair-raising moments at sea. The Rattling Door Knob, from Florida to Atlanta. I was 13 when it happened in our old house back in Florida. I'm glad we moved from that area, because I don't think I'll ever go back. At the time, I lived in a 2-story house near Miami, Florida, and near that house was a park that I frequently visited to play with some friends. One day, I stayed out much later than I should have. Eventually, my friends and I went our separate ways to go home. The twilight was rapidly getting darker, and I don't like the dark, so I was jogging to get home. It was then that I saw a small man beside one of the neighbors' houses. He was hunched over and looked to be breathing hard. I was worried he was hurt or something, so I stepped off the sidewalk and across some grass. I slowly made my way up to him, calling out to ask if he was okay. When the man turned to face me, I stepped back and audibly gasped. The man did not have a mouth. His hands seemed to be mangled, like he had put them in a blender, but there was no blood. What disturbed me the most were his eyes, which lacked all whiteness. They were pitch black. They were so dark they seemed to sink into his skull. He had muddy brown hair pasted to his forehead, and his clothes were dirty as well, covered in who knows what. My brain screamed to run, and so I listened. I didn't stop running until I reached my house, where I opened the door and slammed it shut, then ran to every other door and window to make sure they were also secure. My mom and dad and little brother were home, and they thought I was crazy, as I tried to explain what I saw, and of course, they didn't believe a word of it. Eventually, I dropped the subject, going to my room hoping to distract myself by listening to some fantasy stories I had on my iPod. Later that night, my parents informed my brother and I that my aunt had gotten into a car accident and they were going to the hospital to check on her. They asked me to make sure the doors were locked, and my younger brother, who was 7, went to bed on time. I agreed, worried about my aunt, and I asked them to give me a call if they could to tell me how she was. And with that, they left. Not 20 minutes later, my brother and I were sitting on the couch, watching some mind-numbing cartoons like Kim Possible, when I heard the front doorknob rattle. I would have thought my parents forgot something and came back, but the fact that the door did not open and the rattling persisted and grew more violent told me that this was not them. I told my brother to go to the bathroom with the phone and lock the door just in case. He begrudgingly listened, and I went to look out the front door window. I moved the curtain aside and screamed, falling back onto the floor. To my horror, it was the short, terrifying man with no mouth and deep black eyes. He was trying to grasp at the door with mangled hands, but seemed to be failing to do so. I stayed motionless on the floor, and the doorknob continued to rattle frantically. What made me panic was that the lock slowly began to turn into the unlocked position. That should have been impossible. I jumped up and I pushed the lock back. I held it there, bracing myself against the door. But then, a strangled, choking sound came from the other side, and it almost reminded me of laughter. That's when I began to cry. I don't know how long I was there, or when the rattling finally stopped. I didn't move until I heard my parents calling from the other side of the door, and my brother tapping my arm telling me to let go of the lock. That night, I cried myself to sleep in my parents' bed. I learned that my brother called my father's mobile phone, saying that there was a man at the door and that he had heard me scream. My little brother had heard me crying, so my parents rushed back home immediately. They still think it was some creep trying to get into the house. They think that's what scared me back then. We moved 6 months later, and I'm grateful to say I've never seen the mouthless man again. But now that I'm a grown woman with a husband and my own house and a 1-year-old daughter, I still haven't completely gotten over what happened to me when I was 13. The memory is like it happened just a week ago. So let's just say I take self-defense lessons, and I have at least 3 locks on both my front and back doors. And I will never let my child or children walk to or from the park or friends' houses alone. My grandparents' land, from Bagbug 14. The house my late grandparents owned sat in the Alabama woods. They aren't particularly deep woods, but it's a lot further out than you'd originally think upon traveling there. It was a place that, in my youth, was filled with comfort and felt like a true home. But then, when I was 14, my grandmother passed away. My grandmother was a woman who exuded kindness, and life with every breath she breathed. She was the kind of person that no one had anything negative to say about. She and my grandfather both were devout Presbyterians and would attend church every Sunday. I believe that it was because of my grandmother's light and her faith that whatever evil rested in those woods around my grandparents' home was kept at bay for my childhood. After she died, my grandfather lived out there alone, save for a couple of outdoor cats. He fell into a deep depression, and something about the home, the land around the house, it all changed. It no longer felt like a happy place. My grandmother's absence seemed to be noted even by the forest that surrounded the home. Some nights, my father would go out there just to make sure that my grandfather had someone. My father and I didn't like knowing that he was alone up there, sinking further into her absence. It was on one of these nights that my father spent out there that this happened. It was nothing major, but it was still worth noting. My father liked to sleep out on the screened-in porch, listening to the cicadas, or cicadas, and frogs as he fell asleep. He was doing this one night when he suddenly woke up in a cold sweat. In the next several moments, he discovered what it was that had awakened him. It was a screeching wail that was coming from the tree line. It was about 20 yards from the house. He described it to me as a sound that he'd never heard before. He said that it sounded like it could not belong to a creature of this world. He looked out into the woods, towards the sound, and saw, staring back at him, a pair of reflectively glowing orange eyes. I've done some research, and the only naturally occurring glowing eyes that I was able to find were red, yellow, green, and white. No orange. My father said that the pair of eyes paced back and forth along the tree line, but they never left him. It gave off another of its screams, its wailing barks, before vanishing into the night air. My father eventually went back to sleep, but in the morning when he woke up, he had an unsettling feeling in his stomach. As it turned out, one of my father's friends had committed suicide the night before. My dad thinks it was a demon of some sort out in the woods that night, howling a victory call. A call that claimed joy for the suicide of my dad's friend. I've had multiple nightmares about that house, all involving humanoid creatures with large eyes watching through the windows from the woods. It unsettles me, being out there. Even during the day, I feel as though I shouldn't stray too far from the house. Well, about 2 years ago, my grandfather passed away as well. So now there's no one that lives out there except for their cats. I don't know what my father is planning on doing with the place, but whatever it is, I hope it drives back the evil that surrounds it. Well, that brings us to the end of this Darkness Prevails episode. But don't you worry, more scary stories are on the way. If you have a scary experience of your own, share it with us at darkstories.org. I may just feature it on the show. I'd especially love to hear your story if you have an alleged encounter with the Yeti or other snow creatures. If you want to support the show, be sure to leave a like and a comment, and check the links in the description. Before I go, here are the credits to my patrons, those who have donated before and those who continue to. They're pretty great people in my book. Remember, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.